A scream does not belong in a palace of music. Yet in Topkapi, where lutes once rang and dancers spun in silken light, the cry of a boy could pierce the night and vanish into the Bosphorus. Imagine the scene just moments before: torches blazing across marble courtyards, tables collapsing under roasted lamb and jeweled goblets of wine, and young concubines moving like living ornaments, their songs weaving through the air to please an emperor who sat upon pillows of gold. To watch from afar, it was paradise. To live within it, it could be a sentence of death. One misstep was enough: a laugh at the wrong time, an eye held too long, a gesture mistaken for insolence. In a heartbeat, the same hands that clapped to music could seize the performer, drag him past the curtains, and hurl him into the cold waters below. Witnesses told of sandals bobbing on the surface, the only trace of a life erased before the feast had even ended. This is the contradiction of empire. The boys chosen for their beauty and grace were offered silk, gold, and applause. But beneath every note they sang lingered the possibility of silence more permanent than sleep. They were not heirs to thrones, not warriors of conquest, but shadows trained to entertain and discarded when amusement soured into cruelty. So we ask, how could laughter in the halls of Topkapi transform so easily into terror? How did the empire that crowned itself with glory bury thousands of nameless concubines beneath the river's dark tide? The answers lie in the hidden chambers of the Ottoman court, where power turned human lives into passing ornaments. Stay with us until the end, because these stories are not taught in classrooms. They survive only in whispers. And if you want to uncover them with us, subscribe now and step into the shadows of history. They came from distant valleys and mountain villages, children torn from their mothers in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the edges of the Middle East. Some were sold by desperate families, others taken as tribute, and many simply stolen in the night by soldiers who left homes burning behind them. Their names were replaced with numbers, their languages silenced, their laughter reduced to whispers. The Ottoman court had no shortage of ways to replenish its concubine halls, and boys of striking beauty were prized above all. The journey to Istanbul was itself a slow death of innocence. Shackled together, marched across rough terrain, they learned quickly that tears earned only blows. By the time the city's domes rose on the horizon, the boys no longer walked as children, but as possessions awaiting judgment. They had been carried from the cradle of their families into the machinery of empire, and the gears would grind away everything human in them. What awaited them inside the palace walls was not merely confinement, but transformation. Before they could serve, they had to be remade. The procedure was simple, brutal, and final. Carried into dim chambers that smelled of blood and smoke, they were forced upon stone tables. There was no mercy, no clean steel. A dull blade hacked away what marked them as men. Some bled out where they lay, their screams dissolving into silence as attendants dragged their bodies aside. Others survived, left broken and feverish, their wounds festering beneath rough bandages. To live was not a victory, but a sentence. Eyewitness accounts from the empire's own chroniclers describe how only a fraction of boys endured the mutilation. The rest died before they ever saw the Sultan's halls. The corpses were disposed of without rites, their identities erased, their childhoods forgotten. They were not remembered as sons or brothers, only as failures in a process that cared nothing for the soul. Those who survived emerged into a half-life. The empire clothed them in fine fabrics, But the emptiness was deeper than silk could conceal. They were not born to be men, but to be hollow shells for a throne, stripped of the possibility of fatherhood, robbed of the freedom to grow into themselves. They became instruments of pleasure, silent witnesses to the whims of power. This was the beginning of their existence in the palace, a past amputated, a body mutilated, a future predetermined. They walked the corridors of Topkapi not as children who had once played in villages, but as shadows trained to smile, to sing, and to obey. Their stolen youth lingered like ghosts in their eyes, yet no one within the court was permitted to speak of it. The grandeur of the empire depended on this silence. While the empire expanded across continents, building mosques and libraries, its splendor was bought with the cries of nameless boys lying on cold stone floors. The brilliance of Istanbul's skyline concealed the darkest truth of its heart. And so we must ask, what becomes of a world that raises palaces on the suffering of children? What memory endures when innocence itself is turned into an offering for power? This is where their story begins, not in glory or privilege, but in wounds that never healed. The halls of Topkapi would dazzle them with music and gold, but beneath every jewel lay the echo of childhood stolen long before. Within the gilded gates of Topkapi, the boys who survived were remade into ornaments of the court. They wore silks stitched with gold, moved through corridors lined with mosaics, and learned to glide with a grace that masked the weight they carried inside. From a distance, they could be mistaken for young nobles. Yet behind the embroidered robes, their souls felt hollow, for their lives no longer belonged to themselves. Each morning began with rituals of refinement. Tutors trained their voices to sing, their bodies to move in perfect rhythm, their manners to echo elegance. They poured wine at banquets. They danced to fill the silence of royal evenings. They stood ready with songs whenever the emperor desired music. To the casual eye, they lived in splendor. But those who looked closer could see a quiet shadow in their gaze, the reminder that beauty here was less a blessing than a burden. Life in the harem was a theater of contrasts. A boy summoned into the sultan's chamber might be granted rings, fine garments, even the illusion of influence. For a brief time, he might feel he had stepped into the heart of power itself, yet such favor was never secure. Attention could vanish in an instant, and the very nearness to power that once lifted him up could just as swiftly abandon him. In the palace, survival was never about strength alone, but about silence, patience, and the ability to move like a shadow when the air grew tense. Some rulers made this balance even more fragile. Murad IV, remembered for his severity, lived with appetites that often pulled him into contradiction. Chroniclers wrote of his attempts to control the empire with iron rules, even as he himself was drawn to excess. A concubine might find himself admired one night and overlooked the next, the change of mood leaving uncertainty in every corner. Later came Ibrahim, known to history as the Mad. His reign was colored by eccentricities that unsettled the palace. He could be gentle and lavish in his gifts, then suddenly whimsical in his demands. To serve him was to walk on shifting ground, never certain if one was about to be rewarded or forgotten. In such a world, intimacy was never comfort. To be noticed could mean a shower of luxuries, yet it also meant being caught in the storm of emotions that ruled the court. The boys of the harem learned that discretion was survival, that silence often spoke more than words, and that vanishing into the background was sometimes the only way to remain safe. The palace itself reflected this duality. Its halls glowed with candlelight and music, Yet beneath the melodies lay a silence that seemed deeper than stone. Behind carved screens, the concubines waited, hearts uncertain of what the next hour might bring. They lived in a place where beauty was celebrated, but identity was erased, where laughter filled the night, yet solitude ruled their thoughts. It was a life of contradictions, dressed as if they carried honor, yet always reminded that they were instruments rather than individuals. They had been lifted into splendor, but that splendor was not their own. The empire shone through them, not for them. And so the seeds of tragedy were planted. The boys moved through the palace like reflections of its grandeur, their lives glittering on the surface but trembling underneath. Every step across the marble floor was elegant, but every step also carried the weight of uncertainty. Banquets at Topkapi shimmered with music and gold. Musicians played, courtiers laughed, and young concubines spun in silks to please the ruler. To an outsider, the palace seemed to glow with joy. Yet beneath the music lurked the possibility that celebration could collapse into cruelty in the span of a single breath. Chroniclers record moments when the feast turned into theater of humiliation. At first, the boys were asked to dance, to pour wine, to sing. Then came harsher demands. They were pushed into degrading games that reduced them to spectacle, their fear hidden beneath painted smiles. Guests laughed, goblets clinked, but behind the laughter trembled a silence that every concubine understood. It took only the smallest mistake, a laugh at the wrong moment, a glance that lingered, a step out of rhythm. One boy's laughter rang too brightly during a banquet. The music stopped. Eyes turned. In an instant, joy became terror. Guards dragged him from the hall, his cry replacing his laugh, the sound fading into silence as quickly as it had begun. Those left behind forced their smiles wider, knowing that survival demanded performance even as their hearts froze. There were nights when cruelty escalated further. Fires lit the courtyard not for warmth, but for display. Concubines were thrown toward the flames, their screams rising above the music until the banquet itself seemed to shudder. What began as celebration ended in horror, the scent of roasted meats mingling with something no one dared to name. No protest was possible. To intervene was to join the condemned. So the courtiers drank, their faces composed, their hands trembling beneath the table. The concubines still dancing moved with perfect grace, every gesture a mask. In Topkapi, laughter and screams lived side by side, indistinguishable in the same hall, within the same night. And this is the horror that lingers, not only the cruelty itself, but the way it unfolded beneath chandeliers and music, turning feasts into stages where splendor and brutality were inseparable. Time inside the palace was not measured in years, but in silences. A boy who once sparkled in silks, who filled the night with songs, slowly faded until he became invisible. The halls that once summoned him with applause now passed over him in indifference. His face aged, his hair turned silver, his body bent under the weight of days that no longer belonged to him. It was not wounds of the flesh that marked him most, but the absence of a self. He was no longer seen as a man, for that had been stolen from him long ago. Yet he was not counted among the women of the harem either. He belonged nowhere. Not a man, not a woman, not even a servant with a name remembered. He became something in between, a presence without definition, a shadow that drifted through the marble corridors unseen. In one chamber of Topkapi, imagine a dim corner where a concubine sits alone. Once, he had been radiant, chosen to sing at feasts. Now he folds into himself, eyes fixed on the floor. Courtiers pass without glancing. Young concubines laugh in the courtyard, their voices bright as bells, but none of them know who he is. His name has dissolved from memory, leaving only a body that waits for nothing. The music that once defined his life has ended, yet the silence that follows is louder than any song. This is the cruelest fate. Death came quickly for some, in water or fire. But for others, torment was slower, drawn across the years. To survive was to endure the steady erosion of identity. Each day took a fragment, first the voice, then the grace, then the memory of being wanted at all. By the time age settled into their bones, they were alive only in the most fragile sense. Ghosts who walked before their bodies ever entered a grave. At night, when the palace quieted, one could imagine him listening to distant lutes echoing from another hall. The notes carried him back to nights when he was summoned to sing, when eyes followed his every gesture. Now, no one looked, no one called. The music belonged to others. He sat still, wrapped in the weight of invisibility, until even his breathing seemed like an intrusion in a place that had already forgotten him. This is where the torment of the concubines lives most vividly, not in the blaze of punishment, but in the hush of neglect. Their existence was not allowed to end with dignity, nor did it flourish with meaning. It withered, quietly, until they were neither alive in memory nor honored in death. The palace glittered on, torches flaring, feasts resounding. But within its glow, shadows sat in silence, carrying a sorrow too deep for song. The hall glowed as if the night itself bowed to the empire. Candles flickered across mosaics, music swelled, and laughter circled the air like smoke. The feast had reached its height when a concubine was summoned. He stepped forward with a practiced smile, carrying the jug of wine that gleamed in the firelight. Every movement was deliberate, graceful, rehearsed. To anyone watching, it seemed like a moment of triumph, a boy elevated to the center of the room. He poured the Sultan's cup, the liquid trembling slightly, though his hand never faltered. Applause rippled from the tables. Then came the call to dance. He obeyed, moving with elegance, his steps gliding across the marble floor. Each gesture was flawless, each turn lit by the glow of torches. To the guests, it was simply another performance. To him, it was a last act, though he did not yet know it. A command was given, quiet enough to vanish beneath the laughter. The musicians played on, the guests cheered, but a current of silence threaded through the hall. Those closest to the throne understood. The boy continued to dance, his smile still fixed, even as the air around him thickened with dread. The performance did not falter. He lifted his arms, spun once more, and bowed with perfect grace. When the music ended, the applause rose. At that instant, the guards moved. They did not rush. They walked with certainty, as though their steps were part of the choreography. The concubine was taken by the arm, still smiling, still standing in the circle of light. For a heartbeat, it looked like he would be escorted back to his place. But instead, he was led toward the darkened corridor. The guests lowered their eyes, pretending to drink. The Sultan laughed loudly, a sound that filled the chamber and erased any thought of protest. There was no struggle, no scream. The boy disappeared behind the curtain, his smile the last trace of him that anyone saw. The candles flickered. The musicians began another tune, and the feast carried on as though nothing had changed. His absence was absorbed into the night, unspoken, unacknowledged. This was the cruelty of Topkapi. Death arrived not always in violence, but in silence. A life could be erased with the same ease as extinguishing a candle. One moment a boy was pouring wine and bowing before the ruler. The next he was gone, his place at the table empty, his name forbidden to be spoken again. The contrast was unbearable. The hall remained bright, laughter rolled on, cups were raised, and music climbed into the rafters. Yet everyone present carried the same image in their minds, a concubine smiling, moving with grace, and then vanishing into darkness without a word. It was a disappearance so clean, so swift, that it left no echo, only a hollow where a human life had been. And this is how the empire ended so many stories, not always with blood or spectacle, but with absence. The banquet resumed, but beneath the music lingered a silence that no one dared to name, a silence that told the truth. In Topkapi, a man could laugh, pour wine, and dance, only to vanish in the very same breath. Topkapi still stands, its domes and courtyards shining beneath the Turkish night. Tourists walk its corridors now, marveling at the tiles, the gardens, the jewels that once dazzled foreign envoys. From a distance, the palace glows as it always did, a monument to power and beauty. Yet for those who know its secrets, the light carries a shadow. For behind the brilliance lies a silence that cannot be displayed in any museum. The Bosphorus flows just beyond its walls, dark and eternal. Its currents have carried ships, armies, and trade for centuries. But beneath its waters linger other memories. They are not written on maps or carved into marble. They belong to those whose lives ended quietly, without name or ceremony. Young men taken from distant villages, reshaped, displayed, and then erased. Their laughter once filled the palace halls. Their dances once delighted emperors, and yet their final cries were swallowed by the river's tide. The palace and the sea live in haunting contrast. Above, chandeliers blaze, courtyards echo with footsteps, and the legacy of empire is preserved in stone. Below, unseen, rests the weight of countless forgotten lives. The two exist side by side, light above, darkness beneath, both essential to the story of power. When we imagine Topkapi at night, its towers glowing against the sky, we must also imagine the silent depths beneath it. The empire's glory floated on the surface, but under the water lay the truth that few dared to speak. Thousands of souls remained unmarked, their stories lost, their existence reduced to whispers that the river alone remembers. And so we arrive at the question that lingers long after the music has stopped. An empire can shine with splendor, but can it truly endure when its happiness was built upon bodies buried deep in silence? Can a dynasty last forever when its foundation is made not of stone, but of forgotten lives? These are the echoes that history rarely tells us. They are not found in textbooks, not carved in monuments, but in the shadows and the whispers drowned beneath the waves. If you want to uncover more of these hidden truths, to walk with us into the stories that power tried to bury, stay with us. Subscribe, and together we will listen to the voices that still rise from the darkness.